Well, I'm here with Sir David Higgins. David, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Green Signals. We really appreciate you joining us on the show. Um, I wonder if we could just start a bit with your background, because although I suppose most of our listeners will know you from your railway activity and experience, of course, you grew up in Australia, but then came to the UK, and well, just tell us a little bit about what brought you here in the first place, I suppose.
The blunt answer has been thrown out of America. So when I graduated from engineering in Sydney, there was really no work. Sydney was Australia was in a depression. So I went and worked in Africa, worked in mining and heavy infrastructure, went to South America, tried to learn to speak Portuguese, missed out on that. Was going to work on big dam projects, came back to America thinking I could work there. They took one look at me and my lack of a proper visa and said, "You're out the door." And I landed in London, and London said, "Wonderful to see you colonials back again." And it was welcoming as a country. It was tolerant. It gave me my opportunities. So I worked here for 2 years, both at Chesterfield and then in Guernsey. And so then I had to go back to Australia for family reasons.
Right. But then, of course, came back again, and you came, I suppose, into public prominence. I know you worked in other areas, but you came to public prominence, I suppose, with the Olympic Delivery Authority. That was a really big, high-profile job. Um, what inspired you to do that? Was it just too good an opportunity? Was there a connection with Sydney 2000? You'd seen that? I was always been fascinated why you took that role.
Well, I had worked in Sydney.
Right.
The company I was in charge of, we built the village and the main aquatic centre and other infrastructure there.
Right.
But I spent 3 years at English Partnerships, which
Yeah.
is a government-linked agency that looked at regeneration across the country. And before that, I mean, I knew where Heathrow was in the City of London and the West End was, but I never understood what Morecambe Bay was or West Hull or Hattersley or these places. And I just got in the car and I drove around. I looked at areas of deprivation and where public intervention would work. And then I spent time in East London and I thought, London really doesn't need the Olympics to put it on the map, but the Olympics could force governments into doing decisions and fixing up places which it really needs to happen. So that's why I applied for the job. I wasn't that determined to get into a sports event again, but I wanted to use it to do something material.
Something amazing about the Olympics, isn't it? Because there aren't too many projects where it has to be ready on that day, not 24 hours later, that day. Does that sort of drive the whole, I suppose, thinking and culture and approach to those sort of projects when you know that 24 hours is failure?
I did say at one stage to a senior member of the IOC Council who were coming for the inspection, I said, "Why do you demand these really onerous, horrible contracts with the host city and the host nation? And you come here every in three and 6 months and you name and shame the government in terms of hitting deadlines and everything else. Why these really bad contract terms?" And he said, "Oh, that's nothing to do with us." He said, "We don't need that. London will put on the Olympics. It's a developed world, sophisticated city. We have no doubt that London will be a success. It's for you. Use it." He said, "You'll never get this chance again to force government to make decisions to a set timetable. Get something out of it."
Well, that's a wonderful insight, and it's so obvious when you say it like that. It's terrific. And you had a number of very successful years at the ODA, working obviously with Seb and the team at LoCog and others. But you left to go to Network Rail before the actual Olympics itself. I was always, I kind of got why you went to Network Rail, but I suppose it must have been a little bit of you thinking it would have been good to actually been there and seen it through to the opening ceremony.
You've obviously talked to my family. I know. No, I asked the same obvious question.
Yeah.
Beforehand, we had a big debate within government, and the argument was you couldn't possibly do what we wanted to do in the time. And I set a schedule. I said, well, we'll spend 2 years designing everything, planning. We'll spend 4 years of building it, and then we'll spend 1 year of test events, and we'll finish 1 year in advance. And many people, including some top consultants, said that will never be done. And I said, it will be done. And what's more, when we hit that date, I want to offer commercial style bonuses to the management team to hit those dates. And then we'll shut down our resources dramatically. So when I knew we were going to hit all the infrastructure complete and the permanent venues finished by the year before date, I said to the management team, we're going to get the bonuses, although they withheld mine, I have to be honest.
Charming.
But that's what happens. Wasn't an issue. I said we have to follow through because we're going to remunerate people and we set this expectation. We can't all sit around here and just fire all the secretaries. We've got to start leaving. So I said I'll start with myself because the job's now set up, so succession is fine, and it's now about overlay and the power really and the role shifts to the organising committee rather than the development company. And also I was on the board of Network Rail and the chair, and John Armitt said it'd be good if you went in there. So Ian was stepping down.
Okay, I hadn't realised that overlap, so that makes perfect sense. So you go to Network Rail. That must be sort of slightly odd, of course, because John, chair of ODA, had a huge amount to do with establishing Network Rail, along with Ian Coucher. So you were sort of slightly going into the house that John and Ian had built to a degree. Just sort of tell us a little bit about your time at Network Rail. I mean, I know that's a very broad question for a huge amount that would have happened, but what did you find? What were the challenges? What was your overall experience at Network Rail?
Well, I mean, John and Ian and Peter Henderson and Robin Gisby and many other heroes, they really were fantastic. When you think what they picked up, when you think of Potter's Bar, but you think of Hatfield in particular and Ladbroke Grove, those all happened in a short period of time at their last years of Railtrack, taking that over. I mean, the job must have been so demanding. I'm in awe of what they were able to achieve in the 10-year period of getting the railways, and of course, you know much better than I do the history of that. It's an amazing job with what was done. So when you took over, it was a well-functioning machine, but there was a massively ambitious program of redevelopment, everything from redeveloping King's Cross to Reading Station to Thameslink, a lot of, to right through to London Bridge, a lot of work to be done in the Capital Works program. And then this desire to be able to empower and delegate more to the region. So to get a greater integration between operator and the rail infrastructure company. So Tim Shoveler, Southwest Trains, the idea of making him as the head of the operating company in charge of the integrated railway, both infrastructure and operating.
It's interesting you mentioned Tim, though, because we had a chance to talk to Tim recently. And we were talking about that thing, the alliance on Southwest Trains, which in many ways was so successful, but then it became a problem because there was a financial arrangement, of course, between Network Rail and Southwest Trains. And in the end, the balance sheet and the budget just meant that the two things were not really compatible. I mean, that was a shame, really, because it was a model that operationally seemed to work.
Because you had this rule coming from Europe, essentially separating track and train, even though, as we know, much of Europe doesn't really comply with that. But yes, you're absolutely right. It was an artificial construct of pushing the two organisations that needed to work together, everything from maintenance to dealing with perturbation. And so to be able to carry that out, it required flexibility. It really required leadership also. So we had the head of Tim's company, Brian, was fantastic in terms of wanting this to happen.
Brian Suter, yeah. No, he was very passionate about it, as was Graham Eccles. The whole team wanted to make it work. Team, yes. We may yet be there again. We'll probably come on to that in a bit. I then want to move on, though, if I may, I suppose to the role that is still so in the news and continues to be so, and that's HS2. So you went from Network Rail to HS2. In a sense, that's logical. But I suppose, why really? What inspired you to go from Network Rail into this project, which had been greenlit at that stage, but was still clearly a long way to go?
I mean, firstly, we can blame your co-conspirator, Nigel. I mean, Nigel basically wrote an editorial in Rail and said, David Higgins, you've got a job to do and take up the responsibility and get it. It's true.
Is that right?
He did right.
Well, we've blamed Nigel for many things, so that's good that we can blame him for this as well. Excellent.
It did come about because a couple of politicians, George Osborne in particular, and eventually David Cameron, said, we really want you to do this. It's really struggling at the moment. At the time, it's hard to remember, but the Labour Party were opposed to it, right through from Peter Mandelson to Alistair Darling to John Prescott. The They weren't convinced. They were convinced that east-west was the answer and north-south was not an issue. And my argument was it's never either or, it's both.
Yeah.
You need to do both. And if you don't get the west coast in particular fixed up, and also that eastern leg, then east-west is not going to do it for you. It's not going to bring this productivity improvement and wealth creation that the north deserves.
We'll get into the project in a little bit more detail in a minute, but I just want to just sort of pick up on a point that was made in a recent Institute of Civil Engineers report, which has looked at the lessons learned and the consequences of the cancellation of Phase 2. And it said this: HS2 was first proposed in 2009, greenlit in 2012, so just whilst you were still at Network Rail, just before you'd got to HS2. And it says, worth noting, all official reviews since 2009 have recommended the project should proceed. Parliament has consistently voted in support of HS2 related legislation, and HS2 has had overwhelming support from the cities that would benefit from new growth opportunities. So what was your reaction? We know what other politicians' reaction was. What was your reaction when you heard the news that Rishi Sunak had cancelled Phase 2?
I mean, myself, along with the then Secretary of State of Transport, Minister for Rail, we were all shocked. And it was just such a random decision, which was so illogical. I mean, stage one was always the hardest part to build. It was always the most expensive, the hardest part. People always said, why not start in the north and going south? Well, it really doesn't achieve anything because the massive bottleneck and the hardest to build was the south. The section north to Crewe, 60 kilometres, pretty much flat, a small tunnel at Shrugburgh, no major viaducts and no stations. It was an obvious part to build, and what it did in terms of freight relief was massive.
But I wonder then, sort of taking a slight step back, because when it was cancelled, not a lot of people in the public, I call the general public, shed too much of a tear. Do you think it's fair to say that I suppose the narrative, if you like, the strategic pitch for HS2 had been got sort of slightly wrong? People still thought it was really about 10 minutes to Birmingham, whereas we know it was about capacity and levelling up and re-energising communities. Where did that sort of story go wrong? Because it cost it in the end, didn't it?
Yeah, it did indeed. So it was always about connectivity, and with connectivity, there was also journey time improvements. So it was always both. But
Yeah.
You're right, it was interesting when I started my role, and I was asked to go in there for 2 years and then 3, and finally at 4, I wanted to get the legislation for Phase 1 through Parliament. So that was the reason I stayed for 4 years. But I looked at it and thought, I don't really have to convince the general public. I have to convince 900 people in the House of Westminster, because if we don't get the hybrid bill through, we're basically never going to get anywhere. So that was my constituency to work on. So I spent a lot of time going up and down the lines and it was let's work at shires, at councils, as well as with MPs. And I used to go to the MPs every 2 or 3 months. I'd just take questions ad hoc and solve issues for particularly MPs who had residence issues the whole way through the time of 4 years. But I didn't see it necessarily as my job. I did the Today Show probably 4 or 5 times on it. But my primary focus was getting that through second reading and fourth reading through the Lords and getting that done efficiently. But it was interesting because a senior civil servant, after I was leaving, said, you know, the person we need to replace you, we need less of a politician. You've been, half your life has been a politician. I said, well, I'm not political. And they said, no, but you've spent so much time building a broad church up and down the country of politicians and stakeholders and local authorities. We need someone that's, more going to bear down on costs. Like saying, well, I've done a little bit of that. But anyway, and I think that was the issue, really. You had to move then into public explanation. But let's think about it. I mean, Wembley was an absolute disaster, wasn't it? I mean, if someone came to you and they said on their CV, this is 15 years ago, I've worked on Wembley, you say, next. Sorry, we don't want to talk to anyone involved on Wembley. Who remembers that Wembley was a disaster?
No one.
No one. And you look at Crossrail, remember 2018? He said, she said, I wasn't told.
Yeah.
No, it was finger pointing and what a disaster, and it's going to run massively over budget. Talk to people on the Elizabeth line, they love it.
And nobody could contemplate not having it now.
I know.
I mean, that's the most extraordinary.
My friends who live out in the Thames Valley, they said, we come to the theatre now.
Yeah.
We just drive to Twyford and we're in and back. It's changed our lives.
Yeah, genuinely transformational. No, I completely agree. When the business case came out for HS2 as part of this process, the sort of the full business case, I remember reading it and thinking the strategic business case element, because there's always some multiple parts. There's a strategic case, an economic case, financial one, a project one, whatever. The strategic one was very inspiring, very uplifting. When you read the economic one, it was very much driven around sort of slightly traditional methods of project appraisal, value of time savings, all that kind of good stuff, consumer surplus, all that interesting stuff. But all the wider economic benefits of agglomeration, of changing labour markets, of levelling up, if you like, of massive developments that we're seeing now around Curzon Street, that it said, we know they're there, but we can't quantify them. It's all too difficult. If they had quantified it, that benefit cost ratio would have been much, much bigger. Do you think, looking back with hindsight, that was a lost opportunity?
It was. And the other thing is the way that you calculate it. Firstly, it was what was the occupancy level. Now, I'm thinking back, I think it was based on 65%. Now, if Ryanair was working on a load factor of 65%, they'd be out of business. So, I mean, it should have been working on a load factor of 90 to 95%. Rather than much, much lower. Secondly, the time frame, it was 25 years, if I remember, in terms of the payback, or 30 years, 20, from the start of the project.
Yeah.
So in many cases, by the time phase 2 is finished, you got a few years and that was it.
Yeah.
If it wasn't delivered in that time in terms of benefits and discount it back, forget about it.
And there was no term, like if you put in a residual value for the asset, that would have made a big difference as well.
I mean, when we think about the whole business case analysis, benefits the South. Because you can build something in London and the southeast, and of course, the value of what you're going to build. I was talking to some people that were working on Plymouth on the weekend, and they said our problem is the finished value of apartments is less than £200 a foot. I said, well, that's a problem. You can't even pay for the bricks. It's really difficult to stack things up, and they always say, well, there's far better value for money opportunities in the south, and of course there always will be. But you don't look at the loss of economic productivity that is the result of that sort of planning.
I completely agree. It is skewed, but when you look at that economic case, you think maybe the department should have made excuse me, more of an effort to try and calculate some of those level 3 benefits, because we know they're real. You watch what's happening at Curzon Street now, and you can see it in real life. It's happening in practice.
I think the other thing we never really got across was the massive release of capacity for freight and a commuter on the existing West Coast. Because when you take a Pendolino off that's traveling at 125 miles an hour, you've got to have this large distance in front of it for braking and behind it, followed by a freight train. When you take those off and put them on the high-speed line, then you release huge capacity. So people would say, well, why isn't there a station at Milton Keynes or somewhere else on the line? The answer is you're going to get huge benefits, and it's all going to be about the existing line.
No, I suppose that is the message of that freed up capacity, and trying to explain to people the biggest thing you can do for the traditional, the existing network is actually build HS2.
Yes.
And that has proven to be a very difficult message to get across. I mean, do you think it's just because that journey time benefit just got so ingrained so early on, people wouldn't listen to anything else?
Even the other night, I was speaking at a function for Australian UK infrastructure, and a member from the House of Lords came up and said, we should have stopped this project well before, when Andrew Dennis first thought of it. I said, really? And he said, we should have just insisted on broadband and Wi-Fi and all the trains. I said, you've obviously never travelled between Birmingham and Manchester recently. That's over 2.5 hours. And he just was so London-centric about everything he did. Give them up north something, give them Wi-Fi.
Let's just go back to that ICE report again. The ICE said this: political support for HS2 may have been constructed on tactical concessions given to parliamentarians and other senior political figures to secure their support. So was the buy-in for HS2 actually quite shallow? But then it says something really interesting. HS2 as a project had to navigate 6 prime ministers, 8 chancellors, 9 secretaries of state for transport in the time up to phase 2's cancellation. All of these senior decision makers will have had different ideas of why HS2 was important. And it also says, in addition to change of senior politicians, the key players involved developing change. They included CEOs, chairs, senior responsible officers within the DfT, and so on. I mean, it's, when you hear the list of the number of people involved, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Do you think that did actually have a real impact, that the institutional memory of why we did it in the first place, in the end, just got lost through that process?
I mean, the change, certainly at a political level and at Secretary of State, certainly didn't help because there was no long-term champion that pushed that line. But it's important to remember from second reading to fourth in both House of Commons and the Lords was 90% approval in all those votes. It was overwhelmingly supported at a parliamentary level. But you're right, there was a massive change, and it was just the decision-making process. Every time a new Secretary of State would come in with their own advisors or whatever, they'd want to challenge everything. And there were a lot of political decisions, which sometimes are hard to justify.
I was going to ask, because it's not unreasonable when you go, if you go into a firm as the new CEO, you do a bit of a stock take.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, smart people don't change everything overnight. They kind of listen and learn. But you can understand why a new Secretary of State would want to ask a few questions, surely.
Yes, but in the end, I mean, I suppose the problem is, where's the strategic plan for transport that works for 25 or 50 years in the country? I mean, I think the NIC does a brilliant job, but does government and Treasury really listen to that and think about what they say? So if you look at France, they know the next 50 years of what they're going to do, both nationally and around Paris.
The other comment that I thought was interesting in that ICE report quote was too many transactional concessions made to sort of politicians, maybe to secure their strategic support. I mean, one thinks of all that tunnelling,
Yes.
which, we don't want to be dismissive at all of environmental factors. But I mean, there's a lot of tunnelling on that project, which again, you mentioned the French. I don't think they would have gone about it the same way. That must have been very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we all know that on phase one, the tunnel, the railway line's too deep. It was never meant to be that deep. It's only deep for just political reasons, primarily the Chilterns. We know the section out of London. I mean, it doesn't need to be a tunnel from Euston through to Old Oak Common. Wasn't. And there was half that wasn't going to be a tunnel. It was going to be open cut. And those are all made for political reasons. I mean, I'm sure they were right decisions at the time, and they got some concessions, although every MP in the Chiltern still voted against it.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I remember saying to one Secretary of State, doesn't matter, you're putting a tunnel under, I won't mention his name, that MP's small village, you're still going to vote against it. It's just going to be a very expensive tunnel.
That leads nicely on to cost, because the tunnelling clearly added a lot to cost. Do you think now, sort of looking back, that we over-specified it? And I'm thinking particularly around probably two things. One is speed, going that as fast as it was designed to do, and then also probably capacity, because I mean, capacity is great, but 18 trains an hour was kind of beyond really what anybody else had done. And I suppose the accusation that's made by those who are against HS2 is always, why did you not do what the French did? Why did you push the envelope so far? You just had to have your own gold-plated thing, and it's cost a fortune, and that's why it's been cancelled. What do you say to that?
So, what do you think the budget approval for Crossrail was when it was lodged in the hybrid bill in 2006? And remember, it finished at over 20 billion.
Yeah, a much smaller number.
7 billion.
Right.
7 billion was what Parliament was told Crossrail would cost at that time, and eventually cost, 3 times that price. So yeah, costs go up, and much of it's a factor of time. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the most important thing is when issues change, when you're in a project, the whole way through, you must change, you must challenge and review specifications. So just as I was leaving, we were getting the first ground sampling in the boreholes, and what turned out is that the soil was much worse than we thought it was. It was expandable clay, it wasn't good for reuse, your mass haul diagrams weren't going to work. And so the issue is then you sit and think, is this the right design? Should we be doing slab track? Should we be moving more to balanced? And I think we knew at that time, 2017-18, we were going to lose the eastern leg because there was this huge fight in Sheffield not to do Sheffield, yes, and issues around Nottingham and those areas. And it was just, I thought this will never get through stage 2 reading.
Really?
There's so much controversy and Major Ed Miliband and others who are strongly opposed to various parts of the route. We're never going to get consensus. So that was the time to say, not now, not never, perhaps in the future, we could future-proof it, but let's shrink. And I did advise the then Secretary of State before I left. I said, you've got to shrink Phase 2 build now. You've got to accept the main objective now is just to get to Manchester, and all these periphery routes to Hull and to York, forget. This is a massive distraction. And once you've made that, you then thought Euston needs to be 6 platforms. It needs to be 6, perhaps 7, no more. But that was obvious in 2018. And you can design Euston with the 6 platforms and separate it from the existing station so that if you ever do Eastern Leg in 50 years' time or 20 years' time, you can always put the extra platforms into Euston, and you design the throat to do that. So as I say, when conditions change, you value engineer and you challenge speed, you challenge the foundations. You couldn't challenge the depth because much of that was set out in the hybrid bill and the original design that was out for consultation.
But one of the things that the ICE do say is that when the hybrid bill went through, that the I suppose the budgets and the design were at REBA level 0, which is a very a very early stage thing. And normally contracts are let when you're at REBA level 2 or 3. So do you think that actually the pace that this was going meant that some big decisions got taken, not in haste, but at very short timeframes that then baked in a lot of cost?
Yeah, when I left, we thought that you could get to Birmingham for end of 2026. I know there's a lot of pressure to have it done for the Commonwealth Games then was going to be in Birmingham in 2026, and we thought Euston 2027. And that drove, in projects like this, time is money. So, a project now it's going to be at least a decade later. Well, add inflation, 5% a year for 10 years, you've got a major increase in your cost structures. So I'm not a problem. I don't have a problem with design and build progressively through that process, provided, and it's all about decision-making process. Who are the people that have the authority for change control, to change scope and performance in a logical sequence?
Yeah. Just one last question on cost. You've mentioned inflation, right? Now, the one thing you can't blame any construction company for in the world at all is what's happened in terms of cost price inflation over the last, say, 5-7 years. Partly through, we've had issues around sort of in this country around Brexit, around the pandemic, around the Ukraine war, you name it. Right? But one of the things that I've always found slightly odd was that the government sort of insisted on keeping the budget, the expected forecast cost rate just to at 2019 prices. Nobody seemed to want to own the reality that when you go from 2019 to outturn cost, huge amount of that is going to be inflation, which is not actually the project's fault. It's called life. Do you think that we've got to learn surely from that you should really try and keep costs at an outturn basis as often as you can, so that you don't then suddenly shock people with an enormous great uplift, which is not really anything to do with the project?
No, you're absolutely right. Sticker shock is the whole issue. It started at 2012 costs, and then while I was there, we were talking 2015 costs, and we were quite explicit to Parliament and said, this is 2015 real. We're not escalating the revenue side, and we're not escalating the cost, because if we finish in 2027 or 2037, the figure will be wildly different, and we would have probably forecast inflation in 2015 going forward at 2 or 3% a year. Whereas, in fact, as you know, it went up to 10% a year, and it's not unique. It's not just COVID and Brexit; it's a global supply chain. I work on another mega project in the Middle East where we think costs have gone up 25% in the last 3 years across the board, and that's the same all around the world.
That's fundamentally cost-driven inflation.
Supply chain cost. I'll give you a simple cost. In Australia, the cost of formwork plywood has gone up by 50%, because guess what? All the pine wood for plywood in Australia came from Russia. It no longer comes from Russia. It has to be imported round from Canada and other places. So 50% increase in the cost of plywood.
It's just massive, isn't it? And
and who would have predicted that?
Yeah. And again, not a failure of the project.
No.
It's just an exogenous external factor.
But in the end, do people worry about what Crossrail really cost, or they worry now what the Dome cost or Wembley in the end?
Yeah, never gets mentioned.
But Wembley, there were decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, it was insist on it being welded, high-tech welded, rather than bolted, the arch, and insist on all the public rooms having column-free space. Interesting decisions, but a huge cost to the project. Any value? Probably not.
Let's just talk maybe just briefly about contracts then, because one of the things that I think some people do find slightly not concerning about HS2, but it's just a point for lessons for the future. The contracts themselves were enormous packages of work, which meant that you kind of needed companies with a balance sheet equivalent to a sort of a small country really to be able to take the risk. And because of the desire to transfer as much design and performance risk to the contractors, of course, they then had to arguably gold plate their own solution in order to be able to meet the performance criteria and not get hit with damages. And so the whole thing almost became a bit of a spiral of cost. Do you think a lesson learned from HS2 is probably a different contracting strategy for something like this in the future?
I think a lesson learned for everyone around the world is that fixed price no longer works.
Right.
So I was again looking at this. I was literally last week on advising this client on a mega project, and I said, "You're relying on liquidated damages and lawyers. That's not going to work." I said, "When was the last time that drove performance? You've really got to have a cooperative process, and you've got to have incentives." But you've got to think about your own decision-making process and change control, because that's where you're going to save money. So I agree. I mean, in hindsight, you probably would have done the contracts differently. However, you look at the launching technology of doing viaducts that Vinci brought to the UK. You go up to Birmingham and look at that interchange or interchanges where the high-speed rail crosses 3 mega motorways and the West Coast Main Line. And you go, oh my God. This is amazing that they've been able to do this sort of work with this technology, or Cohen Viaduct.
Well, funny you should say that. I went to the ceremony to see the final segment going in Cohen Viaduct a couple of weeks ago, and I mean we all love big stuff, but it is extraordinarily beautiful, I think. But it's really just the technology there. And I just wanted to ask a question then about supply chain and skills, because one of the things I did when I went to Cohen Viaduct, I talked to some of the young engineers, apprentices who've actually got involved with this project. I mean, that must give you an enormous sense of pride, really, thinking I was part of that. Look at the next generation of engineers we've created from having a project like this.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the simplest example is tunnelling. So before Crossrail, the tunnelling expertise in this country was very poor. And then Crossrail set up the Tunnelling Academy. And by the time they were towards the end of Crossrail, they were doing production rates that were excellent. Now, if you look at the tunnelling that's happened through the Chilterns with that consortium, it's done world-class production rates. And so the country has developed a really strong tunnelling capability. I remember looking at an Italian project, high speed, and I said, your portals for your tunnels, you have a 5% contingency. We need 60%. So how do you do 5%? And they said, well, do you know how many portals we've built in our lives? Do you know we use the same design, the same contractors? We know everything about how to deliver it. So why would we need anything more than 5%? And that was the answer.
So it's a very interesting point when you think about the history of projects in this country. So I remember I was at London Transport when we were doing the Jubilee Line extension. And everyone, no, don't lose that skill you've built. You've done through this massive learning curve. Move it onto Crossrail. Of course we didn't, right? Don't lose it from Crossrail, move it onto HS2. Well, we sort of did a bit. But now, having got through all these wonderful learning curves, where we could have applied all of that to phase 2 and other projects, guess what we're going to do? We're going to stop again. I mean, what on earth do we do in this country to get out of this feast, famine, cyclical process? Is politics always going to dictate that's the reality, or is there a better way?
Sadly, that's probably correct. But you look at rolling stock. I mean, I remember 2011 at Network Rail dealing with Department of Transport, we said this is a rolling stock requirements, both commuter and long distance, that we're going to need in the next 30 years. This is a whole industry. And if we're clever in terms of procurement, we will develop a major homegrown industry here in rolling stock and key components of it. Where are we? Stop, start, Bombardier, no, Hitachi, yes, but now we're going to stop. And it's electrification.
Yeah.
When we started Western electrification, we hadn't done any electrification for 25 years. So we started saying, what should be the tensioning? on the overhead lines when you're traveling at 120 miles an hour. I wonder what we have to do well, let's get to Austria, because we don't have any engineers here who know how to tension overhead lines to the performance we require. And we had to start from scratch. So you think, that's why it costs so much. Yes, that's why our stanchions were designed as they were, because we'd never done it. We lost all the skills. So you need continuity. I mean, we set up the academy, massive amount of competition. Where will we hold it? Birmingham,
They
Derby,
love that.
Doncaster.
Yes.
There's massive excitement about this competition. Open it, it's closed now. So I mean, what in the hell are we thinking about with that? So it's a stop-start approach to procurement, government procurement, and skills.
I want to come back to that point that we touched on a few moments ago, which was sort of that oversight and governance. And I do want to read this sort of final quote from this ICE report. It said, at a time when DfT should have been allowing HS2 Limited greater freedom as it ramped up for the start of construction, it applied further oversight to try to avoid a Crossrail-esque situation arising on HS2. DfT has become very heavily involved in the project to the point where there is little separation between the client and the delivery body. Excessive scrutineering is not productive, nor was it the type of oversight required on HS2. There was a lack of technical design oversight to ensure that what was being built represented value for money. Now, everybody I speak to, admittedly mainly privately, reserve particularly strong words for the approach and competence of the sort of the government side of this project, really, and their oversight role. I mean, it just feels as if the level of management oversight was too involved in the wrong kind of thing. I mean, I'm sure you'll be very diplomatic, but was that your sort of experience? And how do we break out of that cycle?
When I think about Network Rail, when I was running, I remember when the National Statistics Body said we're going to bring Network Rail on the government's balance sheet. I said that singularly will screw up the National Railways, because as a CEO, I've delegated authority of over £100 million, and the board has up to 500 million, and we can make decisions. So we built Reading, and we started Thameslink, London Bridge, you name it, Farrington, Blackfriars. We did a huge amount. We could make decisions quickly. But nowadays, you should look at the delegated authority that Network Rail has at a board level and as CEO, and through the Department of Transport. And ultimately, everything over a fairly minor amount of money is controlled by Treasury. So that micromanagement doesn't work.
Do you think that the reason for that, though, was because HS2 was effectively 100% fully funded by the public purse? If it had been funded in a different way, and we'll come on to talk about Midlands-Northwest Rail Link in a minute, that could have been avoided to an extent? Or is it just these projects are so political that control will end up being there, however you fund it?
Probably it's so political, and the government can't. Ministers are said you have to get control, you have to get a grip, you have to be able to pull the levers, and the public expect the ministers to run the health system,
Got to be seen
or to make the trains run on time. I remember going to SNCF in France one time, and I said, how involved are your ministers in the railways? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, do ministers over here decide the colour of the trains? No, of course. Why would we ask them to do that? Timetables? No, naturally. They know nothing about scheduling a timetable. I said, well, in our world, they decide all of that. They decide when the train stops, the timetablings, the scheduling, and the colours of the trains. They said, how can you run a railway like that?
Well, I've got to ask you, what was your answer?
No, I just smiled.
You just smiled. That's absolutely the right thing to do, I'm sure. Well, look, that takes us neatly onto the Midlands-Northwest Rail Link, because whatever we think about HS2, Sunak's decision to cancel Phase 2 was a gate that you can only go through one way. It's what you then do with it subsequently that matters. An enormous credit, really, to Andy Burnham and to Andy Street then, and Richard Parker's kind of taken it up as well, to do what they did and create that review, which you've chaired for them, and I know it was led by Arab and a proper top tier team. I mean, it's impressive people. So it seems to have landed well. Are you pleased with the response and the reaction to the proposal so far?
Yeah, I think it was fantastic of the mayors to get together and say we're not prepared to sit here and not at least consider an alternative. And all credit to the private consortium at their own cost, no cost to government whatsoever. We had these unusual meetings. I remember going to see the Secretary of State of Transport, and he's saying, you do understand that we have a policy decision of number 10 that stage 2 is dead. So we're not going back to revisit that, and therefore neither Department of Transport or HS2 or Network Rail can actively give you any support in anything that may be challenging that decision. But we're interested in what you're doing, and perhaps if you can give us some drafts, we could offer some comments. And we're very interested to see what your final report to do. So they were caught in this political straitjacket where they knew it was the right thing to do to review it, and all those organisations knew it. But politically, they really couldn't challenge a decision made from the highest point of government to do that. So I was in awe of the team that came together. They worked very efficiently. And you're right, we couldn't say, let's restart, let's revisit High Speed 2 and do it again. You had to break from the past and say, why are we doing it? What's the capacity release? Yep. And as the two mayors said, what's the best way of getting from Birmingham to Manchester by rail? What are the options?
Yep.
Take off all the hamstring, all the requirements, and give us options, and then give us different ways of delivering it. And people forget, High Speed 1 was a great success.
Still is.
Still is. Yeah. Fabulous success delivery-wise. You think of that complexity of coming in from Ebbsfleet into St Pancras. It was delivered by a private consortium, admittedly with a government guarantee, effectively, a golden share, but it was still run by a private consortium, decision-making wise. So
I get that absolutely in terms of that break from the past. And I think the report does do that very well. It sort of, it says we've gone back and rethought. Mm-hmm. But what the report's come up with does look remarkably similar to Phase 2A and Phase 2B. Which I suppose for those who were involved in that first place must be some kind of endorsement and sort of a bit of a pat on the back. But in what way is this not really Phase 2 repackaged then? Why is this different?
We did look at the 4 different options: patch and mend, small bypasses. Let's look at a different route. And then the question you say, well, if you cancel the line of route, which you've currently bought all the land for, you've spent 6 years getting approval. There's a new bit of legislation come through at government, the nutrient neutrality rule, that adds 10% to any major project. This has royal assent. It doesn't apply to this project. So you'll immediately add 10%, just as a matter of course, to any project you start from scratch. It would take a further 6 years to get a hybrid bill through if you want to do that. So you write off $3 billion, and that includes redesigning the whole Handsacre Junction. If you're not going to do the section to Crewe, you have to go back to Parliament and redo that entire junction at a huge cost, because it's just the speed that you need to get onto the main line. So you write off $3 billion, but it will cost you a total of $6 billion from now to finish the section to Crewe. So economically, it made sense. The other point to understand is everyone accepts East-West Rail should happen, and that's particularly Liverpool through to Manchester. Now, if you spend, 15 billion building that track there, and you have 4 trains an hour shuttling back and forwards between Liverpool and Manchester, that's really not going to work at all. But if in the end that track at Manchester Airport connects down the small gap, then down to Crewe, you can divert all the trains from Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, Oxenholme, all down the new section. And therefore, you're not going to get 4 trains an hour on that thing. You're going to get 14.
Isn't it so frustrating? We're having this conversation. Most people listening will be going, yes, obviously. Shared infrastructure, the business case always made sense to kind of have common infrastructure from Highley through to Manchester. You mentioned about the land acquisition. Now, Phase 2, I think only at the moment had about 60 or 65% of the land had been acquired. So we've still got to get over 35% of the land. The powers for that expire, I think, in February 26. So we've really got no time. So the one bit of your report I thought was terrific was almost the very last page, which said, okay, here's the position. This is what we need from government. And it was kind of action this day. Right?
You're absolutely right.
Is that happening?
If you lose the powers of the hybrid bill, it would be a disaster. So the section to Crewe is nearly all bought. You're right. The section further north is further down the track and needs another hybrid bill. To go from Crewe north, it needs to be part of the east-west bill, and that's always been the plan. So yeah, it'd be crazy to lose not only the CPO powers, which you're absolutely correct, lapse next year, but then the powers of the hybrid bill lapse the year after. You can extend it. It seems such an obvious thing. Protect the land, don't sell off the land.
Oh, you can extend the hybrid bill powers, can you?
You can extend it for a period,
Right.
but you have to make a positive decision to extend.
Okay.
So it would just be a home goal to let 6 years worth of work and £3 billion worth of cost just lapse.
Yeah. One of the interesting things in the report is about the funding strategy. And because I suppose, have a slightly, not jaded view, a slightly sort of skeptical eye when I hear people talk about private finance, because in the end, private finance has to be repaid out of the core income of subsidy and fares. But you've actually gone a bit further. You're now talking about business rate capture and even land value capture, which is like a massive Section 106 from what I can, that's
It's Crossrail.
Well, it's Crossrail. So, but I can understand back to the point where we're talking about the difference between property in the West Country and London. It's why Hong Kong Metro works. The land values are so immense that there is enough there to capture, and there's still a very positive return for shareholders. Is that going to be the same with stuff that's going on between Crewe and Manchester?
Yeah, it's a very valid point. And of course, it's very hard to capture if you build 50,000 homes in Cheshire or Crewe, and that avoids you having to use huge government subsidies to build houses and infrastructure in the southeast.
Yeah.
Where do you calculate that? You don't. That's the problem. I'm also a fan of concessions. So we saw a concession, High Speed 1 was sold with the rump of the concession intact. And if it had been sold, well, even 3 or 4 years later, it would have probably got the double the money and gone very close to covering the cost. But if you thought a concession or access charge between Birmingham, Curzon Street and Old Oak Common, it's probably not that attractive to many people. But a long-term concession, I'm talking 25 or 50 years even, from Euston via Old Oak Common to Curzon Street and Birmingham interchange up to Manchester Airport, off to Liverpool and into Manchester on a 50-year concession of build, operate, maintain. It could be just build and maintain the track. So therefore, how you design the foundations and the signaling system and the communication system, that's your risk. You better be careful how you design it. And big companies do that all the time, all throughout Europe.
Well, the example you used in the report, I think, was Bordeaux to Tours, wasn't it?
Fantastic.
And it has worked extremely well.
I was in Bordeaux on the weekend,
Yeah.
and people were saying how fantastic it is we can get to Paris in this short period of time. But also, maybe it's even operate. Who knows? Maybe you want to put some competition in the system and operate a system there. But yeah, I think that those options are open.
You mentioned briefly Euston, I suppose, very quickly. This is a leading question, right? But I suppose, in a word, not going to Euston, mad or not mad?
Mad. Absolutely mad. I mean, anyone. I'll give you a simple description that. Firstly, the problem with Old Oak Common is the Elizabeth line does not have the capacity to take a fully occupied high-speed train turning up at Old Oak Common, because it's going to come in pretty full anyway, and therefore you can't fill it. And secondly, the throat of Old Oak Common, sounds a bit technical, is not designed as a terminating station. So it's incredibly tricky to move trains from one platform to the other, and therefore you're running any sort of decent schedule out of Old Oak Common just doesn't work. And the other thing is, what are you going to do with a large hole in use? Do you want a swimming pool there or turn it into a nature park?
Yeah. I hadn't realised actually with Euston that one of the challenges with it is, a lot of the cost is where it's got to is because of the redevelopment of the underground station, which I'm sure is a wonderful thing to do, but that's hardly a reason to beat HS2 over the head. And the oversight development there would actually be quite difficult. I hadn't realised quite how many protected sight lines there were. So it's a project that appears to have been made very complicated by things that are not actually anything to do with high speed 2.
Yeah, you're one of the few people who realise that. But I always complained about that. So we're bailing out London Underground to a tune of about $1 billion.
It's about a third of it. Yeah.
And so why is this a cost that and London Underground said, well, you want to do something there, you should pay for it. And you're right about the sight lines, but it's not the end of the game.
Right.
I always thought you needed to set up a development corporation. We did discuss this, but it never got anywhere. But you need to set a development corporation that goes right out to Hampstead Road. So you've got a lot of low-rise and housing there, particularly 1960s housing that's 2 or 3 stories. And you can put your high-rise, but also the whole medical research area. I mean, some of the highest valuable commercial office space is now at the Creek,
Right.
higher than West End.
Right.
And there's a huge hub there now for biomedical research. So there's a huge opportunity to go at Euston. And yes, you're right about the sightlines. They are tricky. There's about 2 or 3 different, Primrose Hill and a few other ones.
Primrose Hill to St Paul's, isn't it?
Yeah,
So,
the other ones, yeah.
yeah.
But there is other land,
Yeah.
particularly off the site. It's dumb to build right above stations, high rise, because when you drive the columns down into the platform, so it's very difficult. You have your servicing of your high rise at the same time as you're trying to service the station.
Yeah.
Not even Hong Kong does that sort of stuff.
No, they do it off to the side,
Yeah.
don't they? No, quite right. So just in terms of this report then, what next? You're still chair of the group?
Well, we sort of sacked ourselves.
Oh, right.
But we did say to the government, set up a steering group.
Yeah.
We've got people that are prepared to put their time in to take it the next step. I've read in the Times this morning that the government is at least considering it.
Yeah.
So let's hope
Fingers
it makes
crossed.
it. Fingers crossed.
It does look good. Well, at least they haven't said no, so we'll take
Right.
that. We'll take that as a positive. I just want to sort of draw to a close and sort of ask you, after a career in the highest levels of public life and office, from the Olympics through to Network Rail and HS2 and what you're doing now, you've probably seen it all before. So a perfect person to ask, really. This government is more interventionist. It wants, in one sense, it wants the railways closer in terms of public control. They've made that they did at least say that before the election. There's been no surprises. What's your sort of, I suppose, 30,000-foot view of that? Or do you think in the end it doesn't really matter because it's about the people? I'm just fascinated to know what you think of the current political landscape that the railways are now facing.
It was always strange that the commercial side of running the railways was remote from Network Rail. So all the commercial contracts with the franchise companies were done by a commercial arm of DFT, and then they were lumped on Network Rail. It was saying, well, this is what you're going to have to do because we've made these commercial concessions. And look at the hockey stick. I always loved the hockey stick. Not getting a huge amount of money on the franchise in the first few years, but in the last years of the 15-year contract, we're making a fortune out of it. And of course, it was always a challenge. So I think integrating those makes loads of sense. You're absolutely right. It is in the end all about people. And we need to get over this completely bizarre process of I can't be paid more than the Prime Minister. So, I've always thought, I haven't seen a poor ex-Prime Minister yet. No, because they've got a couple of pensions to say, they've got a few books to write, plus all the rest of it. So we need to get over that. If you want to, it's all about hiring the best and most high-performance people and then delegating authority, try and step back and ministers write their brief, be consistent, and then let the executive get on with it. So I think it's a good idea. Let's hope that ministers find the right people. I think now in Andrew coming into HS2, Mark Wilde coming into HS2, that's a good decision. We've got Andrew at Rail, we've got the right team.
Laura Schoaf, who's just been appointed shadow GBR chair. She's got a lot of experience in the combined authority in the West Midlands. Any words of advice for the as yet unidentified incoming CEO of shadow GBR? What would you say? Having been chief executive of Network Rail, having done HS2, having probably got more experience working with government than almost anybody else, certainly in terms of the railways, what would your words of advice be?
I would say work out 3 things you want. I remember when I went to take over the Olympics and High Speed 2 for that matter, when I met with both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, I said, I only have 3 requirements. I worked out what they were. I want the ability to hire a set number of people that I can pay the right fees for. So I think whoever the CEO is needs to play their cards early and get a commitment, only for a few things, of what they want from government to be able to run the company effectively. It is, I remember when Mark Khan took over from me, I said, Mark, what you're going to understand is every day you come in to running Network, every day you're going to realize the job's harder than you thought it was yesterday. And every day you're going to find the people work at the coalface and that are actually better than you thought they were. That's the only concession.
David Higgins, thank you so much for your time. That's been really interesting. We've covered a huge amount of ground. Very appreciative of that. All the best with whatever you continue to do, and let's keep our fingers crossed for the Midlands-Northwest Rail Link. That would be wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, and please say hi to Nigel for me.
Certainly will indeed.